Being and Caring, A Psychology for Living by Victor Daniels and Laurence J. Horowitz, as read by The Happy President. Part 2, Connecting with Others. Chapter 13, Anger and Aggression. My anger is typically a response to frustration or arousal. Arousal might result from an intense noise or from someone else's being angry or upset. Frustration occurs when I'm blocked from trying to do something, and my anger may be not only a statement of my frustration, but also an attempt to remove the obstacle. Clearly, anger cuts both ways, leading to a gain or loss of respect, to a closer or more distant relationship. The question of how to deal with our anger in ways that help us feel better and get what we want, rather than ways that lead to trouble and feeling bad, is an important one. Anger and other emotions. Anger seldom occurs by itself. It can occur together with many other emotional responses, but there are a few with which it is especially often paired. One of these is hurt. When I'm angry with another person, if I look beneath the anger, usually I find pain. My anger is a defensive, protective response. I can use it to discover where I feel hurt. At the same time, knowing that others' anger is often a response to pain as well as a means of self-protection can make it easier to accept anger from them. Shame, humiliation, and guilt. Shame is the painful feeling that goes with thinking I've acted in an inadequate, improper, harmful, or disreputable way, and that others know about it. Like embarrassment, it has more to do with how I believe you see my shameful event than with how I assess the event independent of you. When I am humiliated, I feel reduced to a lower position in my own or others' eyes. I feel disgraced and my self-respect suffers. Guilt, in a legal sense, involves breaking a law and being judged guilty. Psychological guilt is my feeling that I'm bad for doing what I'm doing, especially when my action is contrary to my image of how I'm expected to behave. I feel guilty when I violate others' standards, my own standards, or standards I've borrowed from others and accepted as my own. I may even plead guilty to an imagined offense and then feel inadequate or unworthy. Guilt is a favorite manipulative tool, the gift that can last a lifetime. When I manipulate you with guilt, such as by reminding you that I've done so much for you that you can never possibly repay me, I don't have to make my demands explicit. I don't risk having you say no. If I control you effectively, you can keep busy meeting my needs and at the same time feel you can never do enough for me. How can you blame me after all I've been through with you? Resentment. When I suppress anger that I feel, I'm apt to convert it to resentment or even hate. Hate is deluxe resentment. In direct proportion to your contribution to my feeling guilty, ashamed, or humiliated, I'm likely to resent or hate you. If I'm sufficiently afraid of losing your love, or am otherwise intimidated, I may stop myself from being aware of my hatred or resentment. Pearls spells out the relationship between guilt and resentment. Behind every feeling of guilt is resentment. It feels much nobler to feel guilty than resentful, and it takes more courage to express resentment than guilt. With expressing guilt, you expect to pacify your opponent. With expressing resentment, you might stir up hostility in him. When you feel guilty, find out what you resent. Pearls maintains that behind every resentment there are demands, and we stop being resentful only after we get them out in the open. For instance, a demand to my father might be, I want you to appreciate me for who I am, not judge me based on your expectations. Those who taught us by guilt, shame, and humiliation came through that same school themselves. Once I've cleared out my file of resentments against you, I can appreciate that you may have done the best you could. This process, catharsis, works when I have said the unsayable and I continue to exist and exist in relationship to you. When I finish my unfinished business with you, I don't have to carry it around anymore. At the same time, I confront my fear of expressing feelings I've held in and develop my ability to express them. Resentment and hate. My aunt invented the Cold War, said Alan. She was always throwing cold, twisting jabs at me and my uncle while pretending to be the nicest person in the world. When I hold back my anger out of my fear of what will happen if I express it, I feel resentful. When I feed this resentment enough, I can reap a harvest of hate. In most cases, both resentment and hate are anger plus fear, or anger plus loss and helplessness. Put-downs, a common form of hostility, often disguise anger. When I disguise my anger in a put-down, as in sarcasm for instance, I'm hoping that you'll be wounded by my anger and not recognize it for what it is. I'll have said it to you and you'll know I've said it, but you won't be able to blame me for it. When I find myself being cold or cutting, I'd better look to see who or what the source of my anger is. Anger is short-lived. It's an event. Resentment and hate are institutions. When I hang on to my resentful or hateful feeling toward you, I don't genuinely deal with its sources. Angry communication that clearly confronts genuine issues can lead to warmth in a relationship, but festering resentment is cold, muddy, and leads to separation, not communication. There's another side of it, too. Separation and alienation can lead to mistrust and resentment. I mistrust what I don't know about. Projection is often heavily involved in hate. I hate you when you say and do things that put me in touch with qualities I reject in myself. Suppressing and repressing anger. Unexpressed, ongoing anger is toxic waste in storage. Instead of being used to seek out more sources of aliveness, it just seeps, leaks, and erodes. There are various flavors of bottled up anger. One is anger drowned in tears. That's often a lady's choice, since it isn't ladylike to show anger openly. Women get angry just as often as men, but are as ladies more likely to hold their anger in and cry. My client Patricia used her tears to distract herself from her anger until she learned to use them as a signal to herself that she is angry. Another approach to bottling up anger results in burying feelings beneath a facade of super-rationality. Self-control is the ideal, and anger is withheld for fear one won't be promoted. This I am not mad syndrome is often part of a larger I don't feel anything pattern. The suppressed anger is apt to go first toward oneself, physical ailments in the body and self-depreciation in the mind, and second toward subordinates, the family and the dog. Victims respond in various ways, including sneaky revenge. The process of retroflexion is involved in the first case. I redirect anger meant for others back against myself. My anger produces a whole series of physical events. Nerves fire off messages faster, hormones are released, my heartbeat speeds up, my stomach stops digesting, and my skin becomes warmer. When my anger is intense and I allow it no expression, I convert it into such forms as headaches, hypertension, ulcers, fatigue, high blood pressure, or cardiac problems. When I deaden my angry feelings, I freeze part of myself, including some of my spontaneity, sensitivity, and creativity. When I don't feel, it's more difficult for me to touch and do. Focused and distorted anger. Focused anger fits the situation that provokes it. Distorted anger is out of proportion to the situation. It's usually a product of my hidden feelings, wishes, and assorted collection of resentments. My rage at my young daughter's desire to take a couple of extra minutes to dress in the clothes she wanted instead of those closest at hand was anger distorted. When I explored that issue with another psychologist, I found myself drawn back to the age of 2. My feeling of being frustrated and held in when I was ready to leave and my daughter was leisurely going through her clothes reminded me of my rage when I threw a temper tantrum and my grandmother shook me and then pinned me to the floor. My rage, so inappropriate to the present situation, was appropriate to the old one it belonged to. When my anger is distorted, I want to discover what underlies it. Then I can deal with that. As long as I'm dealing with old ghosts or hidden agendas, I'm not likely to handle present situations well. Childhood anger. As children, we had occasional temper tantrums. When we learned to inhibit them, someone forgot to tell us that it was okay to be angry, but that some ways of being angry are more effective and less offensive than others. As we found various ways to deny and disguise our true, honest anger, it emerged as purified anger and, in some cases, self-righteous anger. In that state, it becomes the junk food of emotional nourishment. We've learned both the stated and the unstated rules governing how to disguise our anger. In new relationships, anger can emerge before we've had time to agree on rules for handling it. New couples and families, for instance, are often so overwhelmed when even their focused anger surfaces that they feel helpless and wrong. According to Dreikers and Gray in 1968, there are several patterns of distorted anger that we've all been exposed to and all recognize. 1. Demanding undue attention. Hey, look at me! Look! Look! Some of this is natural. It can become excessive when a child feels bypassed or hampered by lack of self-assurance. 2. Pulling a power play. The child tries to control and manipulate, often out of a sense of powerlessness or not counting for much. 3. Being vengeful. I'll get you back for that. Underneath, the child feels hurt and, in his or her revenge, may be committed to being bad and unlikable. 4. Acting helpless. I can't do it. Don't ask, expect, or hope for anything from me. A discouraged failure is resentful of parents' expectations for unreasonable success. Passive-aggressive anger. If I have a hard time confronting you openly with my anger, I may send my message by retreating into cold silence or by going in the kitchen and banging the pots and pans around, and perhaps accidentally breaking your favorite glass. I don't tell you I'm angry, but through my tone of voice, my movements, and my other signals, you'll get the message. And there's nothing you can do to make things right until I've punished you to my satisfaction. This is called passive-aggressive behavior. My unspoken but continuing anger, resentment, allows me to feel self-righteous and at the same time avoid being clear about my grievances and putting myself on the line to work things out with you. I can't help being late, or can I help it if I'm forgetful, are hard to argue with. When I'm on the receiving end of passive-aggressive anger, I get angry in return. If I suppress this anger instead of confronting the other person, at that point I victimize myself and become 50% responsible for the continuation of passive-aggressive process. I can break the spell by confronting the other person. If you have something to say to me, I'd like to hear it. I'll listen to your anger, but I don't want your slow poison. Anger in relationships. Therapist and educator Carmen Lynch in 1978 describes 3 techniques many of us use to support the belief that expressing anger is bad, destructive, and useless. 1. The debt syndrome. Getting angry would mean ingratitude, as though gratitude and anger can't coexist. 2. I can convince myself of your fragility or weakness. The statement here is, you can't handle my anger. Therefore, I'd better not mention it. I'm so thoughtful in my projections. 3. The bomb gets dropped on Luxembourg, or stop me before I sneer again. I'm afraid that the power of my wrath is so overwhelming that I'll go out of control and be sorry, so I dare not say anything at all. But unspoken anger can keep us apart at least as effectively as anger that's displayed explosively or distorted into blame or judgment. By contrast, when we share our focused anger, we can become closer. Knowing that we care enough to listen and work problems through deepens our mutual trust. When you do reveal your anger, I can hear you better when you tell me how you feel than when you focus on how bad I am. The Catharsis versus Detachment Controversy. Shall I tell you politely what I'm mad about, scream and rage about it, or do my best to transcend it and forget it? This issue touches a long-standing controversy. The question of how to best handle anger is more than a personal one. Whole cultures favor strategies that differ sharply from one another. In Italy, a common response to anger is yelling and gesticulating. In Thailand, gracious composure is the ideal, and people seldom quarrel or shout. An American professor at the University of Chiang Mai said, "People here are less bothered by frustrations we can't do anything about and less easily upset by little things. On the other side, they don't cope adequately with confrontation." Physiological studies show that both meditation and catharsis can lead to lowered pulse rates and decreases in other stress indicators. A study by social psychologist Jack Hokanson provides an intriguing lead. He had noticed that unlike men, who often get belligerent when insulted, the women he observed more often said something friendly to try to calm the insulting person down. Physiological data showed that acting friendly brought down their arousal level, just as responding belligerently brought it down for men. Their friendly response appears to involve a type of transcendence, unhooking from the angry response and substituting a different one. In a follow-up experiment, Hokanson found that rewarding women for acting aggressively brought about a change in their physiological response pattern so that aggressive responses began to lead to a catharsis-like decrease in blood pressure, and rewarding the men for acting friendly led to decreased blood pressure following friendly behavior. It appears that we can learn to let go of our anger instead of feeding it, and that in the meantime, the most cathartic form of expression differs from one person to another and depends on our personal history. Van Nuys offers his own criteria for distinguishing whether we've transcended our anger or need to express it directly. When your guts are churning, your breathing is short, your voice is getting clipped or loud or unusually soft, or you're getting obliquely sarcastic but doing your damnedest to suppress it, that is not detachment. That is denial. It is important to own your anger and deal with it. My guideline is this: when I suppress my anger and then feel bad afterward, I need to work on stating it assertively. But if I roar out my anger on the smallest pretext, the task that faces me is either to change to a non-blaming, non-aggressive form of expression, or to work on unhooking or diffusing. In both instances, the required work involves doing what I find hardest. A critical dimension of either approach is learning the difference between assertion and aggression, overtly toward others or inwardly toward ourselves. The catharsis versus detachment controversy has been confused by the mistake of equating aggression with catharsis. Catharsis is unwise, some critics insist. A person who vents his or her feelings through aggressive acting out and feels better as a result is likely to keep on doing so. Turning back to Freud, we find that far from suggesting that we give our violent anger direct expression, he feared that the fragile veneer of civilized behavior could all too easily break down, as he saw happen toward the end of his life in Hitler's Germany. As Freud described it, catharsis involved acknowledging, experiencing, and appreciating our feelings, not acting them out. It involved giving credence to my tears and my angry storming so that I would not need to store them away or act aggressively. But my own experience suggests that one form of acting out my feelings, even my anger, can have particular value. That's acting them out in a way that causes no intrusion or assault on the rights of others. Nathan Azrin in 1967 found that when he shocked a monkey, it hit a ball in its cage as hard as it could. It even learned to pull a string that lowered the ball into its cage so it could hit it. When I hit my finger with a hammer, like Azrin's monkey with its ball, I feel much better if I smack a nearby 2x4 with the hammer. Some people don't need to do that. As for me, it helps. But I won't hit the 2x4 hard enough to damage it because I paid good money for it. I learned to discriminate between harmful and harmless ways of acting out aggression when holding it in completely isn't comfortable. Aggression. Perhaps it's the ultimate irony. Humankind's capacity for blatant aggression, which helped us to dominate every other species on the planet and to drive many species into extinction, now threatens our own survival and our peace of mind. The capacity to murder and destroy and the capacity to act with great love and gentleness coexist in each of us. Once, when my own survival was at stake and I was both afraid and enraged, I murdered a man. The army later tried to give me a medal for it. Without denying that this is part of me, I can choose to what extent and in what ways I want to let it be part of my life. 4 patterns of aggression. Aggression takes various forms. If it's physical aggression, we call it violence. If it involves trying to make people feel bad or look bad to others, it's verbal aggression or emotional abuse. Evidence is overwhelming that most men are more physically aggressive than women, and apparently, women tend to be more verbally aggressive than men. It emerges in at least 4 general patterns. 1. Threat-based aggression. This includes self-defense, aggression that grows out of fear, as with a cornered animal, defense of helpless other persons, and territorial defense. 2. Irritable aggression. We may respond aggressively to pain or irritation. Pain often leads to lashing out. When two animals cooped up together in a small chamber are shocked, they're apt to fight each other. And the popular notion that a long, hot summer can mean trouble has been supported by studies of 102 riots and other disturbances in U.S. cities from 1967 to 1982. The violence consistently occurred during heat waves. Even the irritating effect of cigarette smoke can predispose people to be more aggressive. A 1978 study showed that people are apt to be more punitive toward others in a smoke-filled room than one filled with clean air. 3. Frustration-based aggression. I may behave aggressively when something stops me from getting what I want. This is more than deprivation. It includes an expectation about what I intend to do or get. If I'm deprived of something but don't expect to get it or be able to get it, I'm less likely to feel frustrated to a point of aggression. In discussing frustration, Neil Miller and Robert R. Sears both noted that the way we react to it depends on our history of past learning. 4. Instrumental aggression. This gets me something I want, like a child who gets a toy by hitting another child or threatening to, or someone in authority who uses threats to obtain compliance. Aggression and anger. Aggression is not a simple expression of anger. In studies of convicted murderers, for instance, a peculiar phenomenon appears. Many one-time murderers have never been charged with any other crime and have a life history of being quiet and mild-mannered. The morning headline screams, "Suburban woman stabs husband to death in kitchen," and in a television interview later that day a neighbor says, "Why, I've never heard her say an angry word in all the time I've known her. So, my love, do me a favor and yell at me once in a while. I'll live longer." We find two sources of anger-related aggression. In one case, anger is channeled directly into violence instead of into more constructive forms of expression. In the second instance, anger that is withheld turns into resentment and emerges as direct or passive aggression at some future time. Aggression based on displacement occurs when I am aggressive towards someone other than the person I'm actually angry at. I'm afraid to talk back to my boss, but I can be nasty to my mate. Another form of aggression involves projection. Disowning my own angry and aggressive feelings, I project the cause of my unhappiness and dissatisfaction outward onto others, then try to attack it and eradicate it there. The social context of aggression. Authorized aggression refers to the aggression of soldiers killing in a war, a member of the police jailing and torturing a member of the opposition, and the like. Some structure of authority has authorized the aggression, sanctioned it as socially acceptable, and probably pays and applauds the perpetrator who carries it out. And the authority may, as in El Salvador, protect the murderers when they're subjected to criticism. Indirect aggression, unlike other forms, involves no direct act against a victim. Rather, it involves acting in ways that make it easier for others to be aggressive, such as they do. She's in bed with a broken jaw and he's saying, "We had a little argument." Abusers won't change so long as they can keep on doing this. Someone has to confront them. Gan Lee describes abusers as externalizers, viewing themselves as controlled by the events outside themselves. "I do it because of my wife," or "because of my work." In some ways, we may be victims of circumstances, but our actions and reactions are always our own. Abusers and victims of domestic violence are increasingly contacting their community social services departments and women's shelters and seeking professional help in handling the problem. Institutional violence. When carried out by the state, violence is within the boundaries of the law. When the state is being violent towards me, I lose many of my rights. Economic, ethnic, and racial factors typically influence the way a matter is treated by law enforcement authorities and the courts. When I was living in the ghetto, on various occasions, policemen were unjustifiably violent with me or my friends. Such abuse of legitimate authority provides models that ultimately many of us imitate. War is a socially approved form of authorized violence. We drill young men over and over to perform the act of killing automatically and choicelessly when the signal comes. When the war is over, nothing is done to extinguish this conditioned readiness to kill, so that under stress, the ex-soldier may turn it towards his own society or himself. This complex tragedy is seen as part of what is now called delayed stress syndrome. We don't solve complex, frustrating problems when our response is the oversimplified one of axe or A-bomb. Gandhi stated eloquently, "What difference does it make to the dead, the orphans, the homeless, whether the mad destruction is wrought under the name of totalitarianism or the holy name of liberty or democracy?" In its oppressive frustration, our government jails and exiles young men who refuse to become instruments of authorized violence. Here again, we reward violence and punish nonviolence. Nonviolence, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. One of history's most unusual political revolutions occurred when India ended Britain's colonial occupation through nonviolent resistance. The leader of the resistance movement, who inspired the nonviolent campaign of Martin Luther King Jr. for civil rights decades later, was Mahatma Gandhi. We lost a crucial opportunity to learn to solve problems nonviolently when we turned our backs and our guns on Gandhi and King. The nonviolence they advocated, which Gandhi called ahimsa, was not just a tactic but a way of life, expressed on the job and with neighbors and family. It was not only a negotiation, a refraining from, but an affirmation of the spirit of love and an element in the quest for self-realization. In Gandhi's words, "Man as animal is violent, but as spirit is nonviolent. The moment he awakes to the spirit within, he cannot remain violent." Active ahimsa necessarily includes truth and fearlessness. Nonviolence proved to be such a powerful force in India that when India had succeeded in its quest for self-determination, after Gandhi's death, Nehru outlawed nonviolent demonstrations against the Indian government. Some commentators have suggested that to be effective, nonviolence must evoke a violent response. Not necessarily. In the Diablo Canyon anti-nuclear sit-in in 1982, for example, which enjoyed great media attention, organizers took great care not to only enforce their own nonviolence, but also to discourage violence by state troopers by carefully photographing each arrest. In many conflict of interest situations, an excellent alternative to aggression is negotiation that seeks to accommodate the legitimate interests of everyone involved. End of chapter 13.